So we are the team of the Impact of Tertiary Education on Development research project funded by the Department for International Development. Myself, Tristan McCowan, my colleagues Moses Oketch and Rebecca Schendel. We were the core team for the project, and we all work at the Institute of Education, University of London. So the idea of this research project was to assess existing knowledge in relation to tertiary education and development. A large-scale review of published literature on the topic, and specifically looking at the impact of tertiary education on society. There's a very large body of literature looking generally at tertiary education, but only a small part of that literature actually assesses the kinds of impact that universities and other institutions of tertiary education have on society outside, and the many different forms of development, including economic growth, but also other kinds of development outcomes relating to well-being, human rights, democratization, health, and so forth. So we were looking at university level institutions, but also non-university institutions of post-secondary level, including business and medical schools, teacher education colleges, and so forth. In order to understand the impact, we developed a conceptual framework to try and understand the different pathways through which universities and other institutions of tertiary education can impact development. And in doing this, we assessed a large amount of literature from all across the world, including theoretical work. And we drew on theories such as human capital theory, endogenous growth, theories that are prevalent in the economics literature, as well as institutional growth theory, and capabilities, a range of different ideas and concepts in the literature to piece together a tentative framework for understanding how universities and other institutions might affect development. In doing that, we were very aware that some of the models and findings from high-income countries might not be applicable to low and lower middle-income countries. The fact that these countries have very long established systems and relatively well-funded institutions may mean that the conditions that they're working in are very different. So we created this conceptual framework as a working hypothesis that we were then going to explore when we were looking at the actual results of studies for these countries. The review itself was focusing on low and lower middle income countries according to the World Bank classification. So that's some 100 or so countries, mainly in Africa and Asia, but also some in Latin America. And we restricted it to these countries as these are the major recipients of aid and those of interest to the development agencies and the Department for International Development who funded the study. In terms of the methods of the review, this was a rigorous review, so we followed many of the principles of systematic reviews. Initially, we identified over 6,000 studies. After screening those studies, these were reduced to some 150, which were relevant to the topic in question. They all had to show evidence of impact on development. They were studies in the English language and published since 1990, and that related to those countries in question. We also appraised the quality of all of those studies, and we included finally a list of some 99 which had very robust design and that provided evidence of impact, and it was those 99 studies that went forward to the final synthesis.
Well, there's been some knowledge quite a bit in relation to the role of tertiary education in development, especially the work that was done in the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s and up to about 1990s, particularly for lower middle income countries and low income countries in relation to what they call rate of return. And I think that work is what led to a refocus, especially during what is called Millennium Development Goals, which focused on education for all. And that work basically said that it was important to have more people who are literate, but also ensure that there is a bit of tertiary education. But generally the knowledge was that rate of return was lower for society for tertiary education and higher when you focus on basic education. So the knowledge was there. The knowledge is that, you know, the society benefited more when most people had basic education and less when most people had tertiary education, especially for lower income countries. And so over the years, what has happened is to refocus the debate a little bit around what the evidence shows.
Well, we had findings in a range of different areas. Some of the findings related to what wasn't there and some to what was there. So the initial discovery of the review was that there is a serious lack of research in this area. While there is an enormous amount of literature generally on tertiary education, there is only quite limited literature that relates to the impact of tertiary education on development. But in terms of what we did find, there were some very significant and in some ways unexpected findings. Firstly, there was very strong evidence of the impact of tertiary education on individual earnings. That perhaps is expected. But that was also seen to contribute to macroeconomic growth of countries in a way that was greater than is commonly expected. Historically, there has been an impression, at least, that primary and secondary levels have a much greater return on investment than the tertiary level. And while there is conflicting evidence in the literature, the studies reviewed certainly showed that there was evidence of tertiary levels impact, and in some cases a greater impact than the lower levels. The other important finding was that there were a range of non-economic benefits of tertiary education that haven't been sufficiently emphasised. There were benefits for individual capabilities in a range of different areas in terms of political participation, health and nutrition, women's empowerment, as well as strengthening a range of institutions, both in terms of organisations and also in terms of social norms and attitudes, for example, relating to democracy, to the environment, and strengthening the basic public services which are so essential for development. Clearly, tertiary education has an absolutely fundamental role in forming the professionals who will be working in the education sector at primary, secondary and early years levels, as well as the health services, public administration and so forth. And it is these non-economic benefits and institutional strengthening benefits, as well as the direct economic benefits of tertiary education, that have been strongly endorsed by this review, and that should certainly be acknowledged in the development of policy.
At the moment, I think not quite. Part of what we've done in the review is to build up the evidence base, because the evidence base that exists, which has been existing for almost 2 decades or so, has been overtaken by events. And the reason for this, if you look at Africa, for example, there is what we call youth dividend, and the youth dividend means that fertility rates have gone down, and there are a lot more younger people, and these younger people would feed into tertiary education education. So the idea that if they have just primary education alone is adequate to spur economic growth is not in tandem with what we see there. If we look at lower middle income countries, a number of these countries are growing quite rapidly, and there must be something which is different there, which is happening, which didn't happen 20 years ago, when the debate was clearly that these countries needed basic education. So the evidence gap for policy is clearly there. We don't know enough, given the recent trends in which there is a grower youthful population. We also see increased productivity in terms of economic growth in some of these countries that for almost 20 years was stagnant. So we need new evidence to tell us what contribution is tertiary education doing in this country, and what role can it play in relation to this youth dividend.
In addition to synthesizing the evidence that does exist around the impact of tertiary education on development, one of the main objectives of this study was to highlight where there are gaps in the evidence. And certainly it was clear from looking at the range of evidence that we did find that there's quite a number of gaps. The biggest being just the general lack of research that specifically tries to identify impact. There's a lot of literature out there about tertiary education in low-income contexts, but much of it is normative. There's not a lot that actually empirically assesses how tertiary education contributes to development in a broad range of both economic and non-economic development. So that's just sort of a general gap. More specifically within that, we found that there's a lot more literature looking at the economic benefits as opposed to the non-economic benefits. So certainly there's a lot of room for looking at the ways that tertiary education contributes to human development beyond simply economic growth. And specifically, one of the things we looked at within the review was there's sort of generally, tertiary education is classified in terms of three main pillars, one being the teaching function of tertiary education, another being the research function, and the third being what's often described as service or extension, which is essentially all things that a university or other tertiary education institution contributes to society beyond teaching and research. So often that's knowledge dissemination and exchange, those kinds of activities. And we found particularly there were very few studies that look at that research pillar or the service pillar. Most of the studies look at teaching, and so that seems to be a particularly under-researched area. Another thing that we really looked at, we sort of tried to look at some of the barriers to impact and some of the interventions that have been attempted in order to address those barriers. And in looking at that, we realized there's really not much research that thinks about the different conditions that affect impact. So if you actually want to follow the sort of pathway to impact all the way through, there's not very many studies that look at how the different ways that tertiary education can function, how that really impacts development. And that's certainly a very important policy question, and it's one that is not particularly easy to answer given the existing evidence base. So there's not a lot around how, for example, public versus private provision of higher education might impact development, or how particular models of curriculum or modes of delivery, so distance education versus face-to-face. There's not very much looking at how actually the way that tertiary education functions affects those development outcomes that we were looking at. So that seems to be a particularly rich area for future research. Well, I mean, the first and most simple answer to that is just more research on tertiary education in low and lower middle income contexts. There's a lot of literature that exists about the impact of tertiary education in higher income countries, but not very many in lower income countries. So there's just sort of a general regional gap there. Also, you can see within the literature that there's certain countries that have been more researched than others. They tend to be obvious reasons why. They're large population centers like Nigeria or India, but there's certainly some countries that didn't show up in our review at all where it would be useful to see some future research. But what we really looked at more than the country focus was the topic focus. So as I was just explaining in terms of the lack of research around conditions, that would be a real area where it seems like that would be fruitful area for future research. So in terms of teaching and learning, for example, there's not much research, although we could see in the literature that there was a lot of concern around the quality of higher education. There's not a lot of research looking at actually what seems to make a difference in terms of improving the quality, what actually makes a difference in terms of improving student learning, for example. And in terms of policy and interventions that can be approached, again, there's not much that's been done yet in terms of the types of interventions that have been attempted, and there's certainly a broad diversity of interventions interventions in higher education that have been attempted by external agencies and also national governments. And further work is needed in order to see if those really are the interventions that make the most sense in terms of improving the functioning of tertiary education in a way that will really impact development.